about women in the British Army. My thing is to study the people who were in the British military during the American Revolution, and I study both the soldiers themselves as individual people and their wives as individual people. If you've ever tried to do this, you'll find it's really, really hard because the information is so scattered. But there's a lot we can learn, and I know I'm talking a lot to an audience of ringers here, so I'm going to say some things that you already know, but also things you don't, or things you might not, rather. And I want to give people ideas about how to portray the roles of these women in the kind of context that most of the 18th century reenactments you may go to actually afford you to portray them in. So we already know that an army wife is a working woman, right? If you're going to be in a military camp, even if your goal isn't to portray a soldier's wife, there's a good chance that you're portraying somebody who has to work for a living. So how do you do that? Well, just to put that into some context, I'm going to give some 18th century information and some modern information about how to apply the 18th century stuff. A soldier's base pay was insufficient to support a family. Now, proving that I don't know how to talk with a mic here, sorry about that. And employment helped not only earn money, but also to prevent idleness. So if you keep people busy, they stay out of trouble, right? So it's not only to earn money, it's also to keep people at work and not doing the double work by their hands. Ah, yes, too close to the amplifier. Okay, now I really prove it. Maybe I should just put it back in here. Even though I hate to stand still, do it this way. All right, here we go. Here we go. So to portray an army woman, you want to be a woman at work. If you're going to be around a military camp, you should be doing some kind of work, keeping busy. But the challenge is that a lot of the work that women did for the army were associated with aspects of military infrastructure that we don't usually portray at a reenactment. We tend to portray a camp that was more like something on a campaign than something that was in a town. And I know there's arguments because we actually fall kind of in between those two extremes a lot. But let's look at the most common jobs for women in the army to have. There were washerwomen, nurses, sutlers, what I call private sellers, and we'll talk more about each one of these individually, gardeners, and seamstresses. So we're going to go through these individually and talk about a little bit about what they were and a lot more about how to portray them effectively. Washerwomen. I use the term washerwomen because that's the one that appears by far the most common in the period documents that I look at. I do see the term laundress in the 18th century from time to time, but not very often in military documents. So I'm going to call them washerwomen, even though it's a little bit harder to say. In a British company, which was about 50 soldiers, there are 1 to 2, 3 washerwomen in the company. These are wives of soldiers in the company. In the British Army, you probably find somewhere around 1 out of every 6 or 8 soldiers are married and have their wives with them with the Army. So to put that in context. And a couple or 3 of those women are probably going to be washing for the soldiers. The rates that they charge are usually regulated by the Army, but this is one of the hardest things to find detailed documentation on. I wish I could say, and a washerwoman earned this much per week, but I just can't say that because I don't know. Men paid the washerwomen either directly out of their own pockets or indirectly by keeping accounts kept by regimental officers. It really depended on whether the soldier could be responsible with his money or not. I have a lot of information in my book, Noble Volunteers, which is for sale in the back of the room, about this subject. And we do know that British soldiers sometimes did their own laundry, so it's really hard for us to be absolute and say, oh, women washed the shirts, women washed all the trousers, because we know that there were no absolutes associated with this. Now let's talk about recreating the laundry. Well, In terms of the several different roles I've talked about, this is probably the easiest for an individual to do. Is that font big enough to read in the back of the room, by the way? Can people read that? Okay, good. I'm just making sure. I always want to make the slides better for next time. It's an easy job for an individual except for that unwieldy wash tub. Now, up until a few days ago, this slide had said that big unwieldy wash tub, but then I started looking a little more carefully at pictures and realized that wash tubs don't have to be big to be wash tubs. So it's still kind of a stinky, wet, ugly thing, but it doesn't have to be big. All the pictures I'm going to show you are from British military camps, most of them around London in the 1780s. The reason I use these pictures is because we just don't have pictures of British or American encampments, not enough to give the level of detail we want, and also because we suspect that long-term encampments of the type you might find in Rhode Island or around New York, places where an army spent a long time in camp, may well have started to resemble these camps in England, where troops stayed in an encampment for months at a time. We can't be certain, but we can suspect, and we have to use what information we have, right? So it's hard, it's messy work, but it's visually appealing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about how to make it more visually appealing. And there are related tasks like soap making and ironing and other things that tie in with just doing the wash. So here's some pictures that give examples of things to illustrate. Here's a woman with a wash tub, but she's got her wash tub in a wheelbarrow, which is kind of cool, because not only is it a lot easier to move around, but again, there's visual appeal to it. In the other side on the right, the woman has a wash tub, but it's up on a stool of some sort. So think outside of the tub, I guess. Because remember, everything we want to do, we want to portray something for an audience that wants to look at it, look for things with visual appeal. And one thing that really has visual appeal are clotheslines. I started to notice that clotheslines show up over and over and over again, and they're not real fancy. You see the one over there on the left, there's just a big stick of a tree there, the one on the right on the top. These are just crude posts cut off out from branches of trees. The one on the bottom here appears to be strung between two tents. It's hard to really see. Here are some other ones, the one in the upper left, strung between two tents, but then with a prop up in the middle of it. I grew up out in the country where we used clotheslines and sticking that pole up in the middle of the clothesline. That's a thing. All different sorts of them. Down in the lower left, you'll see, well, there's women spreading clothes out to dry just on the ground in the camp street rather than on a clothesline. So again, these are things just that people can see and look at, and then you can interpret and talk to people about, oh, here's what I'm doing, why I'm doing it. Here's my other new favorites is, okay, clotheslines. Well, just find a piece of rope that's already there. So there's two different examples of clothing just hanging up on marquee ropes, which is fantastic, I think. I also have a written account by a German soldier who was at the siege of Yorktown, and you may know about the storming of the redoubts 9 and 10 at Yorktown. This German officer says, oh, and there were clothes hanging out on the phrases, those sticks that are sticking out at the front of the redoubt, and women had hung up clothes to dry on these things. So there's a lot to do, and again, you don't have to necessarily even do any laundry to have this kind of thing going on to show that, to represent the idea that you're a washerwoman in a camp setting. Nurses. This is one of my favorite jobs because guess what? Clara Barton was not the first military nurse. All British military hospitals had nurses. This is not a picture that has anything to do with nurses. That's just one of my favorite pictures. It's just such a lovely picture of a woman from the 18th century there. A British regiment, which is about 500 men, is just a general figure if you keep a sense of scale, might employ one or two wives as nurses. But then in wartime, the British also set up military hospitals outside of the regimental hospitals where they also employed wives as nurses. And nursing at the time was not something you go to nursing school for. It was a lot more just basic cleanliness and basic caregiving. So there was no training associated with being an Army nurse. But there's a lot of things you can do to portray this. We've got nurses administered the patient's diets, they administered medications, they took care of basic hygiene. Let's talk about how to represent this. Say, okay, before that, sometimes this was a voluntary task, sometimes it wasn't. So they call every regiment to send 2 wives to the hospital as nurses. And if you don't respond, then they're going to get assigned to do the job. And if they get assigned to do the job and refuse to do it, then they get drugged out of camp. But it was a lucrative job. I found rates as much as $1 per day for nurses, which compared to a soldier's base pay of 8 pence a day. And just to prove that I am not lying, this is an actual contingent bill for the 35th Regiment of Foot for the second half of the year 1775 when they were in Boston. And if you go partway down, I'm sure there's a laser pointer on here somewhere that I would...
Big center button.
Big center button. Right down here we've got, let's see, 12 weeks for 2 nurses for the hospital, and it gives the rate of pay that they got, which works out to $1 a day. And then down here, after 24th of September, we've got only 1 nurse in the hospital. Well, this is right after the Battle of Bunker Hill. So early on, we need 2 nurses from the regiment because there are so many casualties. But then over time, as they heal or get discharged from the hospital, then we got to needing only 1. The point is that this job paid really well in the context of work in the 18th century, or work in the time period. So how do you recreate these? Well, nurses are in Army hospitals only. We don't have anything like battlefield nurses at this time, which makes it a bit of a challenge. But in any encampment, it's perfectly appropriate to set up a regimental hospital somewhere on the periphery of the camp. Now, that's hard for an individual to do, but it's not so hard to have a group of people working together on it. And what I would love to see, most people, most women who join the reenactment hobby end up associated with a regiment, right? But you don't need to be limited by that. You can form a reenacting group that is the Army hospital or the regimental hospital. You don't need to tie yourself to anybody's regiment to do this. And the hobby, quite frankly, needs more of this kind of thinking. You don't need to have a surgeon to have a hospital. Think about a hospital ward today. How often is the doctor on the ward? Maybe hardly ever, but how often are the nurses on the ward? All the time. The nurses are the ones who are always present at the hospital. So, there are people who do these great portrayals of Army surgeons, and that's a wonderful thing. They've got all their saws and knives and bloody aprons, but you don't need any of that. Most of the guys in the hospital aren't wounded, they're sick. And most of the time, the doctor's not around anyway. So you can portray a hospital without having a doctor or a surgeon or an apothecary or any of that stuff. You need a tent or 2 tents. Or if you have a building, that's really great to do it in, but you don't need that. Just a couple of tents, some bolsters filled with straw, medicines, a diet board. We'll talk a little more about that in just a second. And it doesn't hurt to have a few guys who are just too tired or lazy or hungover to actually go out and do anything else except lie around to be your patients in the hospital. Shouldn't be a hard thing to put together. Now, getting into the things that you can demonstrate as a nurse. Well, these are all slightly paraphrased quotations from military orders of the time period or military textbooks talking about how to run an Army hospital. Nurses are to keep patients as neat and clean as the nature of their distempers will admit of. That sounds a little bit skeevy, but that's what nursing is about, right? To give them their diet regularly. Okay, so you're giving the food to the patients. That's something to demonstrate. A diet board for each nurse on which are the names of the sick men that she attends and also the nourishment to be given to them. Well, that's great. Now you've got something you can actually show and hold and walk around with, which, we need the material culture things. I don't have the foggiest idea what the diet board looked like. I could guess that it's a chalkboard or something, which makes sense. Possibly one of these hornwork things with a clear front that you put a piece of paper under. But you can figure that out, right? It could just be a piece of paper or a notebook. Their food, properly dressed, pots, kettles, etc., free from cobwebs. Okay, well, so we're preparing the food for the patients. That's part of the work of the hospital. Now we're really getting somewhere. Tea and sugar to be supplied to the patients only. Patients weekly, rather. See that the patients take the medicines ordered by the physicians. So now we've got more material culture to introduce the medicines and how they're carried, how they're administered. Keep the wards clean, sprinkle with vinegar, fumigate them with the smoke of wetted gunpowder, frankincense, or any other aromatic. Again, things you can show that you're doing. Chamber pots and close stools emptied and well washed. Now we're getting some great stuff. You can clean chamber pot. Okay. Maybe focus on some of the other things more than that. But you see where there's a lot of material culture things you can do to bring a hospital to life and have something you can show and demonstrate. Orders hung up in every military hospital to show the nurses their duty. Again, something to demonstrate. Nurses not to go out of the hospital without having a ticket of leave signed by the physician, surgeon, apothecary, or head nurse. So again, a ticket, a leave, a pass when you're a nurse, but you're not in the hospital. So there's a lot of visuals and a lot of things you can handle and show to people here. And it doesn't have to be complicated or require $1 billion worth of surgeon's tools. Sutlers. What do we mean by a sutler? A sutler is a licensed purveyor of provisions for the army. So they sell stuff, and they sold in the 18th century, in the Revolution, sutlers sold anything that soldiers would buy, which pretty much means they sold liquor, because soldiers don't need to buy much stuff besides liquor. The army provides them with a lot of things, right? Now, we can also document sutlers selling things like tobacco, soap, cheese, bread, and other odds and ends, occasionally even things like shoes. But for the most part, they're selling liquor, because for the most part, that's what soldiers want to buy. Clearly, we don't want to be selling liquor at a reenactment. There are limits, but there are things you can do to portray a sutler. I have a few slides here that just show the variety of sutling booths that show up in these pictures of camps in the 18th century, because I like them. This picture probably doesn't show up very well, but on the right there's a beautiful sutler's tent, this big marquee type of tent, and there's a real party going on inside. And next to it is another sutler's tent that clearly is just thrown together out of boards and logs and pieces of cloth and anything else that can be thrown together. In this one, in the background, there's a sutler's booth that's a little building. And in the middle, there's a sutler's tent that's a nice tent. And then in the foreground, there's a carriage with the wheels taken off of it and the sides opened up. It's pretty much like taking a food truck and knocking the wheels off. But it shows the variety of ways that sutlers might be purveying things. And there's even simpler ways to do it if you don't want to go out and buy a carriage and knock the wheels off and haul it around. So recreating the sutler, it can be difficult because it requires a lot of stuff. Well, what do you do if you don't want to get a lot of stuff? You work together with other people. And here again, I would love to see somebody and say, oh, what group do you belong to? And instead of saying the 4th Middlesex Militia, they say, oh, I'm with Mrs. Swindle's Sutlery. And me and my 12 other people, we get together at the events and we put together this sutling booth, because some of us own this part and some of us own that part. You know, one owns the tent, some of the others own the... You can do these things if you work as a group. And again, you can have a reenactment group that's not tied to somebody's regiment. These pictures just show how simple a sutling tent can be. In the upper right, it's a lean-to, but if you take a regular tent that has flaps in both the front and the back, you can use this as your very own tent to sleep in, and then during the day, you can rearrange it with some long poles into this sideways sort of A-frame type thing and make a sutling booth out of it. How about that? You don't need a lot of extra stuff to do it. In the upper left, on the very left-hand side, again, I apologize that it doesn't show up so well. These things look so good close up. And I'll be very happy to share these images with anybody who wants them. On the far left, there's just an awning thrown over a pole that looks like it's a great big old Persian rug or maybe a wall-hanging tapestry or something like that. Again, it's nothing fancy. Lower left, we have just an arrangement of sheets and pieces of cloth to make screwed partitions. And the only reason I guess that this has something to do with sutling is that there are, and you can just barely make out there's some tables and chairs inside. So again, it's just a cordoned off space, but it doesn't even have a cover over it. The one on the bottom left is important because it's just an awning. Now, looking closely, I was like, okay, that one has a building and a whole bunch of giant hogsheads and barrels and other things. Well, it's kind of assembled from whatever is around, but if you can just make an awning, if the site you're going to go to just has a building or some trees, you can put together a sutling booth with hardly anything. So the point is to not be limited by thinking that you need a whole lot of stuff in order to do something that has some visual appeal and gives a vehicle for demonstration for the public. Private sellers, this is my own terminology just to distinguish these people selling things in camp from these sutlers that are licensed by the Army. A private seller could be anybody selling goods to the military who isn't a licensed sutler. Sometimes this was tolerated by the military and sometimes not. We find orders to allow people from the town or soldiers' wives who are licensed to be selling things and orders for them to be chased away, depending on the context. It's often local women selling things to the Army. Recreating a private seller isn't very difficult. You can just start looking at pictures of private sellers from the time period. The Cries of London, and there's a few other cries of, that just show the wide variety of things people will sell and the way they carried them and made them be for sale. So here's your chance to go out to a reenactment and walk away at the end of the weekend with more money than you arrived with. Wouldn't that be a nice thing? Well, how do you do that? Well, look around and look at the kinds of things that everybody needs. I say everybody, I'm kind of leaning toward all the soldiers at least. Every regiment has their own distinct things that they need, but there are a lot of almost generic things that everybody needs, like cockades. You can make a whole bunch of cockades, because guess what? They fall out of people's hats and they get lost, and people need new ones. And they're pretty similar to each other. Non-perishable food is always a great thing to make. Make breads or other kinds of things from the period. Thread, always nice to have good period thread. Stockings, everybody always needs good stockings, right? Get a bunch of them, walk around, sell them at the event. Knives, gun flints, neck stocks, handkerchiefs, pamphlets, bayonet scabbards. There's something that's almost generic across any unit, right? Now, I know that during the 18th century, you're not going to find a woman walking around in the camp selling gun flints and bayonet scabbards, right? So we kind of make some allowances here. You might disguise the scabbards a little bit for the public, but sell them privately. But the point is to think of things that lots of people need lots of. And you might be able to make a little money by having them available and selling them in the camps. And just to prove that I'm not making this up, this picture on the side here is by Francis Wheatley. And the title, it's a detail from a painting, but the title of the painting is Soldier with Country Women Selling Ribbons Near a Military Camp. So it doesn't get much more blatant than that this is something that happened during the time period. Selling food, that's always a good thing to do. General orders given in Rhode Island in 1779 said, there being great reason to suppose that soldiers are encouraged to plunder fields and gardens by soldiers' wives and other small retailers purchasing from the vegetables so stolen. So we have petty merchants, small retailers who are selling vegetables that have been procured by soldiers who are plundering the farm fields. And guess who they're selling those vegetables to? Other soldiers. Round and round it goes, right? Gardening, this one gets a bit on the periphery of the ability to directly associate it with work of army wives. I have not found any official nice military order saying every regiment to send X number of wives to work in a garden. But I have found plenty of orders for soldiers and regiments when they're in one place for any amount of time to set up gardens. And anywhere around a town, common activity for a local person too. We also know that army hospitals had hospital gardens. So if you set up that hospital, here's something in addition besides all the other things we talked about with the hospital. But how do you portray gardening at a reenactment? Well, you gotta be a little bit creative, but you can do it. You bring some tools. You can bring some modern shovels as well as some 18th century, some nice period-looking ones. And you bring some vegetables to plant at the event. Till the ground, which you can do the night before or early in the morning and get some soldiers to help you out and just dig up a patch of ground to make a garden. And then take some nice fully grown potatoes or turnips or carrots or other root vegetables and put them in your garden. And then all weekend you can be out there with your hoe or your rake and you can be tilling around these vegetables and telling people what you're doing and why you're doing it. Take it in shifts, but you can take the same vegetable all weekend, dig up and replant the same things over and over. I mean, it might sound a little silly, but think of how cool it will be when a family comes up and you can say, here, you think your son or your daughter wants to take the hoe and see if they can find a turnip in the garden? Just think how effective that is. So there's some serious work involved here, but it's a really great interpretation. And again, it can tie in very nicely on the periphery of a camp or associated with an army hospital, give this really great vehicle for interpretation, and be a perfectly valid thing for a soldier's wife or a member of a local population to be doing. Other kinds of military employment that we can document, but we can't really interpret very usefully. The Army often had women go out and help with the haying, because when the hay has to come in, it has to come in right now, so everybody gets involved. Peat cutting, if you were in Rhode Island and you happen to be an Irish woman who knows a thing or two about cutting peat, you can get sent out to the peat bogs, which didn't make peat that was as good as your peat in Ireland, but there it was. Again, this is not something we can portray very well, but I throw it out there just to show the variety of kinds of work the Army had to offer. Now we'll get back to things that you can portray. A lot of seamstress, a lot of sewing going on in the camps, in the modern reenactment camps, but sewing for the Army was usually done by the Army's own tailors, but not all of it. When the Army did a lot of things quickly, they asked for the women to help out the tailors. I'll give you some examples in a moment. Typically, this was for items where we needed a lot of them quickly. So, for example, Thomas Syme's Military Guide for Young Officers writes, no sergeant to be employed to buy necessaries for the men. Necessaries are shirts, stockings, and shoes, for the most part, things that are necessary to replace on a frequent basis. No sergeant to be employed to buy necessaries for the men shall receive any advantage thereby, except that of employing his wife to make up the linen. Okay, so a sergeant's wife or a corporal's wife might be making shirts for the Army. Royal Artillery orders in Montreal. All the old tents to be cut up into trousers for the men. The women of the 3 companies of artillery to be employed in making them. Okay, so now we're getting women making military clothing. And going down to Charleston, South Carolina in 1780, the tailors and women of the whole brigade to be employed in completing the 1st Battalion with trousers. Boston, 18th Regiment, May 1775. The tailors and those women who choose to comply to be set to work tomorrow morning at making the officers' tents. A British Army surgeon wrote, We employed all of our women, soldiers' wives, intended for nurses to the hospital, in sewing 4,000 bandages, which we 2 surgeons made that week. Now, I have no idea what sewing a bandage entails during this time period, but here's some sewing that women are doing. Again, see the tie-in with the hospital, more depth to the impression. So how do you recreate doing this kind of work in a camp setting? Again, work as a group. Get a nice defined area that looks like a place where a project is going on. If you can find like the corner outside of a building or a nice setting under a tree or somewhere that looks like an established space, however you can create that. And then work together on either what's the same project or what can look like it's the same project. Once again, who would like to walk away from the reenactment on Sunday afternoon with more money than they arrived with? Anybody? Make something that is widely used that you can work together to produce. For example, men's shirts. You could sit together and see how many of these you can manufacture in a weekend and probably sell a lot of them. Gaiters that actually fit around the person's leg in such a way that they will keep all of the crap out of the low-topped shoes like they're supposed to. Just look around and see how many look like little accordions bunched up around the ankle, which are useless. I imagine how cool it would be to have a couple of people saying, hey, I will fit your gaiters for you. Drop them off and come back in an hour and I'll have them re-stitched so that they fit your leg the way they're supposed to. Or do it while you wait, whatever works. You can make some money doing this stuff and also improve the hobby at large. Make haversacks. Everybody needs haversacks. They're almost generic, right? So look for the things, again, that people need a lot of, and then, set up the Continental Shirt Factory, which was an actual thing in Philadelphia in the 1780s, and just make this stuff that people need. You can make a lot of things partially made. Men's shirts are such that you could partly make them up and then fit them to the individual and finish them off at the event. So you can not only be entrepreneurial, but you can provide a great service while you're doing it. And also, again, when the public comes around, what are you doing? We're the women of the town making shirts for the army because they need them. All right. Just a few more little odds and ends before we finish this up. How many jobs are we talking about that the army can provide? Well, a typical British regiment, which, again, the nice ballpark figure when you see the word regiment is to think of it as about 500 men. Clearly, sometimes they were bigger, smaller, all kinds of stuff. But if you have that in mind, it just gives you the order of magnitude we're talking about. If it says 10 regiments were here and 5 regiments there, that gets you close enough. You're usually going to find 60 to 80 women in a regiment this size. So you're usually going to find about 30 of them working as washerwomen. See, I used the word laundress, even though I said I wasn't going to. About 10 of them working as nurses at any given time, and maybe 5 or so of them working as licensed sutlers for the army. So that's about 2/3 of the soldiers' wives could earn income just by working for the army directly. And then, of course, the other third of them has to figure out their own ways to make money, but we've already seen some of those possibilities here. All right, so just as a reminder, the 6 most common employments that British Army women and probably American Army women had when they're associated with a military encampment are washerwomen, nurses, sutlers, private sellers, gardeners, and again, a little bit of a caveat around that one, but it's really good for reenacting, and doing seamstressing work. That's all I got right now. I do have a blog. If you really want to know about individual British soldiers or individual wives or individual soldiers' children, I have lots of neat stories about them on my blog. I have an email address if you want more information about any of this. And as Jim mentioned, I'm the managing editor of Journal of the American Revolution, which you can subscribe to absolutely free at allthingsliberty.com. And I can take questions, even though I probably pretty much already told you everything I know.
My question is, I've heard that women who work with the Army also got official rations. Do you know how that works as opposed to getting paid or getting commission?
Okay, the question was, women working for the Army got official rations. As a generality, in the British Army, and again, which is my thing, British soldiers' wives who accompanied the Army did get rations from the Army, irrespective of the work part. So if you could do work for the Army and also get rations, you could come off pretty well, because, hey, the Army's providing your food for you. Does that answer the question? Okay. There's one in the back, then we'll come in the front.
The photos with multiple tents, do you know where that came from? Where that image?
Oh, I do know where all the images came from, and we can talk about that after class here. I can get them to you. We'll sort that one out. But yeah, these images are from places like the British Museum, the Yale Center for British Art, other places like that. But I got them all on my computer right here. If you got a USB key, I'll give them to you.
Is this set up for just couples without children? And if the soldier dies, what happens to the working wife?
Okay, there were two questions there. One, does this only deal with couples with no children? The answer is no. I didn't talk about children, but I said 60 to 80 wives in a regiment, typically. Similar number of children at any given time. So some of these women are single, some, are childless, some have children, some have multiple children. That was question one. Question two was what happens after the woman dies. I have another talk that really goes into, just focuses on stuff in the 18th century, but when the woman's husband dies, the British Army gives her the option of going back to her husband's place of birth, wherever that may be. It's usually going to be somewhere in Great Britain. She gets passage on the ship getting home, and then she gets a sum of money to get her to wherever that town is. And she also is entitled to any of her soldier husband's back pay and any of his property that he owns. Interestingly, I found some cases where widows of British soldiers, soldiers who died in America, end up getting married again to other soldiers in the Army, but not for a couple of years in some cases. So that there's one actually who was killed on April 19th. So I know the man, I know who his wife was, and she gets married again, I think it was 3 years later in New York. Now, what was she doing in the meantime? No idea. Because everything we know about her is in that marriage record that says she's the widow of this guy, and now she's marrying that guy. And by looking on muster rolls, I can find out when that guy died. But we at least know that sometimes widows and other single women stayed with the Army, but the information then is so fragmentary, I can only guess that she must have been doing some kind of useful work for the Army and was able to support herself. But overall, yeah, the widows get sent home. They're not just cast off by any means. This question straight up, Paul. Yes?
Similar question to the earlier one about money.
Yes.
In this case, are we talking pounds, shilling, pence, or are these people operating local currency, or how does that work?
Well, that's a great question. So the money, how did that work? Well, one of the unfortunate things is that we don't have a lot of detailed records about how these people were actually paid. I showed an example of a hospital contingent bill where the money was recorded in British currency at the time, pounds, shillings, and pence. I don't know how the people were paid. The impression I have is that they're paid in local currency, or no, not in local currency, in local specie, hard money, coins. And because the coins are made out of precious metal, it doesn't matter what nation's coin they are, they all have value. In those rare cases when we find people talking about what money they had or lost, we find say a case of someone saying, well, my purse was stolen and in it were 2 Portuguese half-jocanas, a golden guinea, and 5 pence, and $2. You know, you'll get this weird amalgamation of coins from different realms all being used together. So no uniform system is where I'm going with it. And again, determining how much a woman could actually earn is really, really, really hard to do. Okay, I'm going to sweep over this way now. This one.
What were the restrictions on soldiers bringing their wives with them? Was there a limit, or we had to be a certain rank?
Okay, what were the limits on soldiers bringing their wives with them? I am going to throw in a little detail here, is that I'm working on a book on this very subject about British soldiers' wives. It's going to get into a lot of this stuff. I have another talk that I'll be happy to give for anybody who wants it that covers some of these things, but there's a myth and there's a reality. There's a myth that 6 women per company were allowed in a British regiment. The reason where that comes from is that when the British allocated quantities of ships to send regiments from Great Britain to America, they allocated enough shipping to carry 6 wives per company. That doesn't mean that's how many women actually came. That just means when we're doing all this math to figure out how many women are allowed, or how many people we need to put on the ships, we're going to use this as an allowance. So you'll hear this number 6 per company, and it's not fixed. The real answer is there is no fixed number of women allowed in the regiment, and they're very wide range. I said typically 500 men and typically 60 to 80 wives, but I found cases of an individual regiment with double that number and another one with half that number. And these are the wives that accompanied their soldiers. I know many women didn't come to America. Soldiers married in America as well. So there's a lot of variation there. Company officers were supposed to give soldiers permission to get married or not, which shouldn't be a surprise to anybody who knows about the modern military, where when there's some sailor at a naval base in the Philippines who comes back to his officer and says, oh, I met the woman of my dreams and I want to get married her now. The officer has some leave to restrict that kind of thing. How successful they were at restricting soldiers from getting married whoever they wanted is a very difficult question to answer. But we don't have any rule that says only this many wives are allowed to be with the Army at any given time. I was going to take this one first.
Was the Army ever contracting non-married women, or were they really looking to employ soldiers' wives?
Oh, that's a great question. Was the Army ever contracting non-married women, or were they looking only to employ soldier wives? Again, a tricky question because it's very hard. There's a lot of cases where I can identify the woman, but I can't identify the husband. Most of the women I can identify are referred to as Mrs. This or Mrs. That, and sometimes with muster rolls I can correlate that name to a soldier's name. There is at least one woman, this was in the French and Indian War, a woman who was a matron to the hospital, who was known to have been not married to a soldier. I don't know if she was married at all, was in fact the matron to the Army hospital. So it seems that there were cases where non-married women were with the Army. And I talked about the widows too. I have a number of cases of widows who remained with the Army even after their husbands died. But in terms of never having had a connection to a soldier, I can't say that I'm sure about that either way. Sorry for the vague answer, but sadly that's the nature of the information that we have to deal with on this subject. Vague. There was a question here in the front.
Prostitution, I don't know whether, I know the times were puritanical, but was there prostitution around the camps?
Was there prostitution around the military camps? The answer is yes. However, everything I deal with when I'm working with this is I'm talking about British soldiers' wives. I'm not talking about people who lived in the town where the Army happened to be. So was there prostitution? Oh, I'm sure there was, but that's not part of where my studies go, because I'm looking at the soldiers and their wives.
Yeah, I bet.
So, other questions? All right, thank you all very much.